Hello, and welcome to the Allen Press webinar, Establishing an Ethics Policy for Your Journal. I'm Joanna Gillette, Product Marketing Manager at Allen Press, and I'll be your host today. On your screen, you should see some general information about participating in today's webinar. I'm going to go over a few of these items very quickly before we get started. Our presenter will be answering questions at the end of the webinar. If you do have questions, you can use the chat function of WebEx to direct your questions to the webinar host, which is me, and you can do that at any time during the presentation. We're using Voice over IP technology to broadcast the audio for today's webinar, so please make sure you have the volume turned up on your PC if you're having trouble hearing. To avoid background noise, participants joining via Voice over IP will be muted automatically. Please do not unmute your microphone at any point during the presentation. Voice over IP quality may vary depending on network traffic. So if you're having trouble hearing, you can always call in to listen to the webinar over our conference line. The toll-free telephone number and participant passcode for the conference line are listed next to the green telephone icon on this slide. If you do call into the conference line, please be sure to mute your telephone. You can continue the conversation with us and your fellow attendees after the webinar on the Allen Press Facebook page. Here you can post a comment, share an idea, or even ask a question. And we also encourage attendees to tweet during and after the event using the hashtag APWeb34. Today, Beverly Lindeen will share best practices for establishing an ethics policy. As ethical issues become more prevalent in the publishing industry, the necessity of establishing and enforcing an ethics policy for your publication becomes more crucial. Beverly will discuss not only the benefits of enacting a policy, but will also share important elements of a good policy, as well as ideas for ensuring that your policy and related procedures are communicated to those involved in your publishing process. Beverly Lindeen is the Editorial Services Manager at Allen Press. She has a BA in English from the University of Kansas. Beverly has been with us for 16 years, starting her career as a proofreader. She now oversees the managing editing, copy editing, and proofreading departments, as well as serving as managing editor for several publications. Over the last 8 years, Beverly has worked directly with the editorial offices of more than 20 journals and regularly provides advice and guidance to her managing editing staff on issues that concern the editorial staff of their journals. I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Beverly now to get us started.
Thank you, Joanna. In today's webinar, I will be talking about establishing an ethics policy for your journal. While issues of misconduct are not new to the scientific community, the increased accessibility of published scientific content available on the internet has likely made stealing or repurposing content and data a lot easier to accomplish. Additionally, our global community has the potential to complicate matters of authorship, as researchers involved in experiments together are often no longer located at the same institution. As the reach of scientific research stretches further around the world, and that world becomes smaller due to internet connections, it is increasingly important for journals to have ethics policies that are easy for editorial offices to implement and easy for reviewers and authors to access and follow. So why have an ethics policy? First of all, the ethics policy stands to protect your journal. It makes it clear to authors and reviewers what the journal's expectations are for professional conduct. It's good to note that the definition of professional conduct may differ from one country to the next, and a clear policy makes sure that all authors and reviewers know what your journal expects of them. Having everything lined out in a policy, such as copying content from an already published article is not okay, duplicate publication is not okay. Being really specific will make it clear to people who have different ideas of what professional conduct is, makes it so they know that your journal does not consider certain things okay. It also outlines the procedure for investigating suspected instances of misconduct. Having a process that's laid out for the editorial office to follow ensures consistent investigation and resolution of all claims. It also potentially limits the future instances of misconduct. in some cases, somebody may target a particular journal and attempt to plagiarize content multiple times. If you have a clearly established policy that is easy to access and easy to understand and is consistently enforced, then the journal has a reputation for having a policy that's enforced, and they're less likely to experience repeat offenders. Another reason to have an ethics policy is that this protects the authors. Research can take years. Writing a paper can take many months. There is an element of trust that comes into play when authors turn over their hard work to strangers for evaluation. They must be able to trust the journal with their research findings. So how an ethics policy can protect the authors is that it limits the possibility of research ideas being stolen by reviewers. There's obviously a confidentiality that comes into play that the reviewers and editorial office must maintain as a paper is being reviewed, and authors have to trust that their research ideas are not being stolen by those reviewers who are reading the paper before it ever gets published. Another way that this protects authors is it prevents unauthorized authorship changes. This ensures that an author would not be excluded from the list of authors for any reason. There can be attempts after a paper is accepted to change the list of authors for one reason or another if there happens to be an authorship dispute. Having a good ethics policy will protect authors from that sort of situation occurring with their paper. It also limits the instances of plagiarism of that published article content. If you have a good ethics policy that includes the requirement that a copyright form be signed and submitted by the corresponding author, that copyright form is a legally binding document and does protect that published article content legally from being copied. And lastly, having a good ethics policy maintains the journal's integrity. Well-established, clearly communicated policies help a journal to project an image of integrity. So let's talk about the types of ethical issues that you're likely to encounter in the journal publishing world. Things to be on the lookout for. First of all, we have duplicate publication. This would be submitting a paper for review to more than one publication at a time. It may be seen by some authors that if they're desperate for having their paper accepted by a publication, they may think that it's okay to sort of cast a wide net. Take that paper and submit it to several journals within the field of study, and doing so is just not okay. It is necessary to only submit to one journal at a time, wait for acceptance or rejection, move on to the next journal if need be. So duplicate publication can also include sending an article to a journal that's in a slightly different field of study, taking that article that was already published in one journal and thinking that it's okay to send it to another journal for review that maybe is not in the same field of study as the original publication, but doing so is not okay either. It's also not acceptable to change slight things about a paper. For instance, I've seen situations where an author will change a title, remove a couple of the authors, and then change maybe a paragraph or two within the article, and then attempt to have that article published by a different journal. It's still duplicate publication in that case. So the biggest thing to be on the lookout for is obviously plagiarism. Plagiarism is reusing without permission elements of an already published article, and that includes text, tables, and figures. So everything within that article is protected by copyright, and copying any portion of it without giving proper credit is considered to be plagiarism. That plagiarism can also stretch to thoughts, ideas, or expressions in papers that are currently going through peer review but have not yet been accepted. I think it's important to note that there are cases where plagiarism might be unintentional. For instance, you have a PhD student who was involved in a research study while they were working on their dissertation, and after they graduated and got a job, somewhere in industry, decided that they could maybe reuse some of the elements of that paper in their current research study and in the current paper that they're writing, and not realizing that this is not okay because they don't own the copyright for that particular previous paper. So in that case, that would be a situation where we have unintentional plagiarism, and just educating that particular author would be necessary in that case. There's also situations of self-plagiarism. That previous example is a good one. Authors sometimes, I think that they are allowed to take portions of an article that they already have published and reuse it in another paper. If they have multiple research experiments going on similar topics, and some elements of a previous paper may be germane to the paper that they're currently working on, that it's okay to just borrow from that previous paper, and it's really not okay to do that. And I think in some cases there is possible malicious intent in that, writing one paper and thinking that the author thinking that they can repurpose chunks of it here, there, and everywhere to kind of beef up their CV and have more publications with their name on it. And but in some cases, authors just don't realize that it's not okay to do that. So self-plagiarism is something to be on the lookout for. And then there's obviously, just the plain malicious intent. There's been plenty of examples recently where there's been articles that have already been published, have been pieces of it are stolen, written into another article, and the author's intent is to see what they can get away with. Not actually doing the work, taking pieces from a previously published article and attempting to get it published, and hope that they are not going to get found out. So another thing to be on the lookout for is fabricated data. This is something that's a little bit harder to detect. And it's something that hopefully could be caught during the peer review process. Some authors are pretty desperate to have their research findings published. For some people it can be the difference between gaining tenure in their institution and not, or gaining a promotion where they work, or not gaining that promotion. And so being on the lookout for data that has been altered in order to obtain a result that is favorable, that is considered to be misconduct. And it can happen in not only the text, within the text of the article and the data that's presented there, but figures can be altered as well. The images that come out of, X-ray machines or microscopes can be altered in one way or another to, change the contrast or the coloring or whatever, that can prove a different result than what was actually obtained in the experiment. Another thing is undisclosed conflicts of interest. A conflict of interest is when a primary interest is influenced by a secondary interest, such that the objective evaluation and judgment are compromised. So for instance, if you have a researcher who happens to be on the board of a pharmaceutical company, and the research that he's involved in and the paper that he has a co-author on, it just happens to be testing a particular drug, and that's been produced by that pharmaceutical company. Obviously, a favorable result for that experiment on that particular drug is going to benefit not only the author, but the pharmaceutical company. So having the author disclose that particular conflict of interest is important for the peer review process. The editorial office, the reviewers, and the associate editors know that there is potential conflict of interest there. Another Another example would be somebody who submits a paper who is a close colleague of like the associate editor. Disclosing that conflict of interest is a good idea so that you're not potentially assigning a paper to an associate editor who knows personally any of the co-authors on a paper and could potentially influence the outcome of that peer review process. So there's also unethical research methods. Did the author obtain approval from the institutional review board? Did they obtain permission from the subject in the research to publish photos of them? Did the author collect and maintain data according to general standards for that particular field of study? These things should be accounted for in the paper itself, and if it seems at all that generally accepted research methods, ethical research methods were not followed, then there should be follow-up with the author about that. Another ethical issue is researchers or reviewers taking ideas from the papers that they review. Oftentimes that research is, particularly in some fields of study, is groundbreaking, and if several researchers at different institutions are working on similar research projects, and a reviewer sees a paper that has similar elements to their particular paper or their particular field of study, there's a code of conduct that comes into play with that reviewer, keeping that information that they're reading in the paper confidential, not stealing any of those ideas, and not potentially attempting to delay the publication of that paper, by not returning their review on time in an attempt to see that their paper on the same subject is published first. Changes in authorship after review is something to be on the lookout for also. The list of authors should not change. Once the paper has been accepted, the list of authors should not change at all. There should not be somebody added or deleted from that list unless there is approval from all the authors on the paper. And authorship disputes. It's entirely possible that an author doesn't agree with the findings in a paper or the way that the findings are presented, and so it might crop up during the peer review process or even after a paper has been accepted, and possibly even after a paper is published, that some of the authors don't agree with each other about how the paper was written or how the findings were presented. So what are the elements of a good ethics policy? First and foremost is the copyright form. This is that legally binding document that all authors should be submitting to the journal either upon submission or upon acceptance of their paper. If you don't have one already written up, it's important to create one. Some smaller journals may not have seen the purpose in having one in the past. If they've not ever been targeted for plagiarism, they may not have seen the reason to have a copyright form, but it is really important because if you don't want your authors to hold copyright and the society or publisher holds the copyright, then it's important to have a document that is clear and states the fact that by signing the form, the author agrees to transfer the copyright over to the publisher or the society. It's a good idea to consult with a copyright lawyer if you don't have one, if you don't have a copyright form already written. In some cases, some forms will have even sections that are devoted to federal government employees. Their situation is a little bit different than privately employed employees when it comes to their ability to transfer copyright. And some forms will go into detail about that as well. But talking to a copyright lawyer to have them read over the document that you've come up with is a good idea. collect those signed copyright forms. Nowadays, it's okay to have only the corresponding author sign the form. It's not really necessary for every author on a paper to sign the form and submit it. The corresponding author is considered to be the person that represents the interests of all the authors. So it's only necessary for that one person to sign it. But it is important to be consistent about collecting those signed forms. And there's several ways to do that. You can either have it available as a PDF that an author could download, print out, sign the hard copy, and scan it and submit it electronically, or they could sign the PDF electronically. There's also some peer review systems have integrated a checkbox that all the author has to do is check the box that indicates that they are signing that copyright over to the journal once the paper is accepted. And if the list of authors or the title changes at any point during peer review and you've already collected a copyright form, it's necessary to collect a new form, and that new one would have the changed title or the changed author list on it and would replace the previously obtained form. It's important to archive those signed forms. Collecting them is not enough. You have to keep track of them. The best way nowadays to do that is through your peer review system. Most peer review systems have a way of, at the very least, allowing the authors to upload that copyright form, an electronic version of that copyright form. The benefit of doing that is that as your papers move through your peer review system and are published, ultimately they're going to be archived. And in whatever archive schedule that you have, the copyright form will live with all of the other files that are associated with that particular article. So should you need to go back and refer to it, it's pretty easy to find because it's just archived with all of the other files for that article and all the other identifying information for the article, and should be easy to look up. But we all know that sometimes we don't keep things electronically, so some people prefer to have hard copy. And having the hard copy is fine as long as you have a system for keeping track of and filing away those hard copy forms that can be transferred easily from one editorial office to another. Most journals have set terms that an editor-in-chief will be with the journal, and after 3 or 5 years, it changes over to somebody else. And it's important to make sure that you have easily transferred files with regards to your copyright forms. If the editorial office is where those forms are being stored, then it needs to be, your system needs to be such that those forms can be transferred to the new editorial office. An alternative to that system is to have the forms stored at the society office if they have space for such a thing. That way you don't have to worry about transferring from one editorial office to the next. But it is important to archive those signed forms one way or another because you never know when you're going to need to refer to one in the future. Another element of a good ethics policy is the authorship statement. The authorship statement can take the form of a form that each author fills out and signs and submits. It can also be something as simple as something that the corresponding author acknowledges when they submit the paper through the peer review system, but it should confirm each author's contribution to that paper. You know, Dr. Smith conceived of the experiment, and Dr. Jones actually collected all of the data, and Dr. Walker did the writing of the paper. So it breaks it down so that each author's contribution is obvious, and that will make it clear if somebody's name was added who really didn't actually contribute to the paper at all. Requiring a valid institution and contact information for all authors is important in the authorship statement because there may be cases where a corresponding author is not available. Years from now, if you have trouble contacting the corresponding author, if you have contact information for all of the contributing authors, then you have some other outlet for contacting somebody on the paper. Corresponding author traditionally is the person who's representing the interests of all of the co-authors, but it's becoming increasingly more acceptable to contact the contributing authors for one reason or another, either during the peer review process or after a paper has been accepted. One group of journals that I work with, what they do with their author acknowledgement is to have each author, when the article is submitted for peer review, those authors are required to have an account in the peer review system with a valid institution and a valid email address. When the paper has been submitted by the author, the corresponding author, an email goes out to each one of those contributing authors and essentially says, this person has submitted a paper titled whatever to our publication, and you've been named as an author on this paper. And if this is not correct and you don't know what we're talking about, please contact us. The assumption is that authors are going to get this email, and most of them are not going to reply because they acknowledge that they are an author on the paper. So no news is good news in that case. Requiring a conflict of interest statement is, I think, a necessity as well. This can be a field on your peer review submission form that the author has to check a box, or actually write in text in a box that says, I acknowledge that I have no conflicts of interest, or I acknowledge that I received funding from such and such a company. If you don't have that integrated into your peer review system, having a statement either in the cover letter of a submission or on the title page of the article is a good way of collecting that information and not allowing that paper to get any further into the peer review process unless there is some sort of statement, either that there are no conflicts of interest or that there are some, and here's what they are. So let's talk about technology. In addition to those forms that you should be collecting from your authors, there's also a couple of pieces of technology that can assist you when you're trying to figure out if something has been plagiarized or altered in some way. The first is plagiarism detection software. Authenticate is not new to most people. This is a software that is available to Crossref members, and most peer review systems have it integrated into the system, whereby it's really just a click of a button, and that paper, the text of that paper, is compared against a database of 40 million works across 590 scholarly publications that are all members of Crossref. And what it does is return a matching percentage. So the system will tell the user, this paper, this percentage of the text within this paper matched other papers that have already been published. And every journal needs to establish what they consider to be that threshold for a percentage. Some may think that 50% is too much. Others may think that 50% is just fine. It depends on how big your field of study is, how many journals are within that field of study, and how many researchers there are within it. It could be that there's a lot of sharing of content in a ethical way, and so the possibility that a high percentage, a matching percentage, would be returned would be possible and okay in those instances. But each journal is going to have a different threshold for themselves of what's acceptable and what's not. There's also some image forensic software available from the Office of Research Integrity, which is a division of the Department of Health and Human Services. They have this thing called a forensic droplet, which is a desktop app for Photoshop. It can you can process one figure at a time or batch process several images at a time, and it can detect alterations to the images, such as if there were, if the author changed, like erased some portion of the figure in the light or dark areas of a figure. It also can detect false coloring, and you can also compare images to each other. So there's some options, technological options out there to help with detecting plagiarism for articles that have already been submitted. So once you have those elements in place, collecting your copyrights and your authorship statements, and you have some tools to help you figure out if a submission has been plagiarized, the next step is to develop a workflow for investigating any claims that may come into your office. It's important to outline specific steps to take in that investigation. You know, editorial offices are oftentimes populated by volunteer editors who have day jobs that take up a lot of their time, and you know, the journal, running the journal is the thing that they do kind of on the side, and running the peer review process and the publication of each issue is time consuming enough without having to worry about investigating any claims of misconduct. So you want to make this process as easy as possible so that it is followed every time there's a claim that's submitted. So, you know, for instance, step one could be the suspected misconduct is reported to the editorial office in one way or another. They just receive a report that something's been plagiarized. Step two could be that they collect as much data from the reporter of the misconduct as they can get, and then step three would be double check all of their documentation. Do they have a copyright form about that particular paper? Did they have author statements from all of the contributing authors? Step four could be, you know, research that particular claim. You know, dig into what the reporter claimed. You know, where was this other publication of this paper? How much of it was copied without permission? You know, just do all of your research and collect as much documentation as possible. Step five could be, you know, if it turns out that yes, the claim is valid and there was some plagiarism involved here, you know, contacting the corresponding author of that particular paper and inform them about the findings. And then, you know, the final step could be contacting the journal, the other publication where this other paper appears, and discussing whether or not a retraction is necessary. So having those steps outlined and making them as clear and easy to follow as possible makes it easy for the editorial office, makes the whole thing a matter of routine, and ensures that every report is treated the same way and that they're all investigated fully. And it's also a good idea, once you have researched the various claims that come in, keeping a record of that. Keep a record of where the claim came from, you know, who reported it, what actually happened, what paper was involved, who were the authors on that paper, what was the resolution of that particular claim. And I think it's important to keep track of all claims, whether or not they're found to be valid. This is a good way to see if there's some sort of trend with a particular author, and can help you possibly prohibit certain authors if you discover that, you know, this particular person has attempted, you know, duplicate publication on so many occasions within the last 5 years. You know, we maybe don't want this person to submit to the journal anymore. So keeping records is a really good idea. And again, that's something like the archiving of your copyright forms and author statements. You want to be able to keep track of it in such a way that's transferable from one editorial office to another as editors change. Occasionally, there may be a dispute between authors. As I mentioned before, you could have a situation where authors don't agree with the way that their research was presented in the paper, or they don't really agree with the findings themselves, and You may find that after a paper has been submitted that one of the authors will come forward and say, hey, I don't agree with this, I don't want my name on this paper. It's important for the editorial office to not get involved in those disputes. On the off chance that it may seem that the editorial office of the journal has bias towards one side or the other, it's important for the authors to handle those disputes among themselves. If you run across this situation while an article is still in peer review, put it on hold, give the authors a certain amount of time to resolve the situation. If it's not resolved, then withdraw the paper, and give them the option of resubmitting it at a later time whenever they come to a resolution of that dispute. But I wouldn't get in the middle of it, because then the journal office ends up trying to be mediator in a potentially impossible situation. So once you've developed this new policy and your workflow for investigation, it's really important to communicate that new policy. Make a big deal of it. Publish it in the journal website and in the author instructions. It should be in some prominent place on the journal website. Once you release this new policy, if you're writing a completely new one, it's probably a good idea to put something on the journal website in a prominent place that says, hey, we have a new policy and here's where it lives and here's the link to it. And in the author instructions, if you have a version of them online, outline the entire policy right there in the author instructions. And that way, when authors are reading through your instructions about how they should format their paper, all of that paper writing stuff that's individual from one journal to the next, they can also have all of the ethics policy information right there as well, so that they're well informed before they ever submit the paper. It's a good idea to have in a prominent place contact information for the journal. If you're worried about having the editor-in-chief be inundated with reports of misconduct, might be a good idea to have a specific email address that is just for these types of situations. It's a good way to filter out any unwanted email, and a good way to sort of cordon off those emails that pertain to claims of misconduct. But it is a good idea to have that contact information readily available. It communicates to the readers of your journal that you take your ethics policy seriously, and that you kind of are asking for their help. If they notice something, that you have somebody available that can take their concern seriously and investigate it. If you have a printed version of your journal, put a notice in that printed journal on the society page. If you have like a masthead page that has all of your society information, it's a good place to put it. You don't have to put the entire policy, but maybe refer to the policy in its entirety. Hit the highlights and then refer to the entire policy as published on your journal website. You also could have, if you're looking for filler pages, come up with a filler ad that states that, hey, we have this new policy and here's where you go to find out what it is. And social media is always a good place to get the word out. So tweet to your followers that you have a new policy and here's the link to the entire policy. Put something on your Facebook page about it. Just let everybody know that you now have this new policy and that you're going to be enforcing it. So of course, with any new thing that a journal attempts to do, there's going to be challenges implementing a new ethics policy. The first is that getting the word out. Make sure that you use the venues that are open to you and make it as easy to access as possible. Putting it, like I mentioned before, on the journal's website, using social media. Just get the word out that you have a new policy and that you're going to be enforcing it. Making sure people read and understand the policy. People don't like to read long documents. As anybody who deals with long author instructions and attempting to enforce them knows, it is frustrating to get people to read through documentation thoroughly. But it is important that if you go to the extent of writing this policy and come up with a system for enforcing it, that people read and understand it. A good way to test that with authors is, if you have it buried somewhere in the policy that copyright form and author statements are required, and you don't get those from a particular author, it's probably because they didn't read the policy. So instead of just providing those blank forms to them, you can point them in the direction of the policy and say, hey, we have an ethics policy that requires that you do a few things. So here, please read through this thoroughly, and when you're finished, then submit the required forms to us. It's possible they won't read it anyway, but you can't really make people read stuff, but you do your best to help them along the way and let them know that they are going to be held to the standards that are lined out in that policy, so they do need to read and understand it. And another thing to do is, once you have that policy established, if it's brand new and you've not ever enforced this kind of thing before, have all of your active reviewers and your associate editors, or any handling editors or scientific editors, have them read through the policy and submit a signed statement saying that they did so. That way you know that everybody's been given the same information, and nobody will at some point claim that they weren't told or didn't know that there was a policy. And keep those statements on file in case you have to refer to them in the future. Enforce your policy consistently. Having a policy isn't going to do any good if you don't ever enforce it. It may get tedious to have to research every claim that comes in, but it is important to enforce policy, your editorial or your ethics policy, consistently. Every claim that comes in, research them all the same way. And that's where having that workflow that's lined out will actually benefit you. Make it part of a routine so that it's not so much of an effort, and it really does just become part of the business of working on your journal. And if you have repeat authors who have been publishing with your journal for many, many years, and they've never had to sign anything before, and they've never had to go to the extent of having their co-author sign anything, it may frustrate some of those that you suddenly have this new policy. But I think if you explain to them that the policy is there to not only protect the journal, but to protect them, in most cases you're going to find that they will eventually comply with the new policy and will submit the forms that are required. So in summary, a good ethics policy protects the journal, and it protects your authors, and it maintains journal integrity. Ethical issues can include various forms of misconduct as well as changes to authorship. So be aware of all the different things that can crop up that are considered to be misconduct. Create a policy that includes copyright forms and author statements, and be consistent about collecting those forms and archiving them. Use the technology that is available to you. Develop an investigation workflow. I've said it twice now, but I'll say it a third time, that having an investigation workflow will make it easier to investigate any claims that come in. Make it part of the routine, and don't have any bias towards not researching some because they don't seem credible. Research all of them, and doing that will be easier when you have an investigation workflow. And then get the word out. All of the avenues that are available to you to communicate with your readers, get the word out that you have a new policy. And then enforce that policy every time. Collect those forms, archive them, and investigate those claims that come in. So this is a lot of information. I don't want you to feel like you have to reinvent the wheel. there's a few resources that you can consult, and this is a very short list. There's actually a lot of information out there that even if you just Google plagiarism and scholarly publishing, I was, I don't suppose surprised, but there was a lot that came back that was returned on that search criteria in Google. So, but the Committee on Publication Ethics has actually a really good set of workflow diagrams that deal with how to investigate each type of misconduct that might be reported to a journal. They've got many, many workflows, and they're all really well spelled out into diagrams, so they have a lot of really good information on their website. And the Office of Research Integrity is where that image forensics software is available, and they also have a lot of good information about plagiarism in general. A lot of pages to read through and a lot of good information. And then Authenticate, just have a link to that. They have a lot of in the section of their website where they have all their press releases. There's a lot of good information about researching plagiarism claims. So those are a short list, but a list of resources for you, so you don't feel like you have to really start from scratch. So we will open it up to questions.
Okay, thanks, Beverly. We have had a couple of people chat in questions, and you can continue to send those questions in to the webinar host while we commence with the Q&A. So the first question that I received has to do with changes made during the editorial process, specifically to the title of an article. So if the title of an article changes during peer review or editing, is it necessary to obtain revised copyright forms for the paper that include the new title?
I would say that during the peer review process, yes. I was actually thinking about this earlier today because I know that, where I'm mostly involved in the journals that I work with is on the editorial side. So in journal production, at the part of the journal production of, typesetting, editing, and typesetting. And occasionally a title will change. And I don't know of any journals that I've worked with that require a copyright form to be obtained when a title changes during editing. But I also think that most copy editors probably shouldn't be making substantive changes to a title. If there are elements of style that need to be followed, for instance, if em dashes are not allowed but colons are, and the use of ordinals, and instead of spelling them out, that kind of thing, or changing histological to histologically or vice versa. There shouldn't be any substantive changes that would require a new form to be submitted. But during the peer review process, if changes are made to the title, then I would think yes, that they should submit a new form.
Another thing I thought of is, if you have on your copyright form the title of the publication, of the article, you might also consider having other identifiers for the article. So, for example, if you're assigning a DOI early on in the process, you could include that piece of information on the copyright form. And that way, even if there is a small change to the title of the article, it's pretty clear what article you're discussing because the DOI shouldn't change.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I think that, I don't know that I've ever seen a DOI on a copyright form, but nowadays, if you have a peer review system that is assigning those DOIs, that happens at the point where the submission is complete. So that DOI is available if you don't require that a copyright form be submitted at the beginning of the peer review process, but rather you require it after a paper is accepted, or acceptance is conditional upon submitting that form. I imagine that it would be okay to include that DOI since you already have it anyway.
Sure. So the next question is about conduct for reviewers. And you mentioned that, of course, it is a possibility that a reviewer might find interesting information in the research that they're reviewing and want to use it for themselves. So how can you keep reviewers from stealing ideas from manuscripts they're reviewing? Is there an agreement that journals can have reviewers sign? What kind of tips and suggestions do you have for that?
I think this is really where the idea of having the reviewers that are active reviewers read your policy and submit some sort of signed document saying that, you know, they read it and understood it, they realize that it's not acceptable for them to, you know, take ideas from the papers that they're reading, that there's a certain amount of trust that's involved in them having access to this not published content. And, you know, when a reviewer becomes a reviewer for the first time for your publication, have some sort of statement that you have them sign before they are made active as a reviewer that you keep on file. Paperwork is always a good thing to keep track of in case something does come up. Then you know that this person understood what the policy was. You got a signed statement from them, so they should they know that you take professional misconduct seriously, and that you will investigate and resolve any issues that might come up.
Thanks. So there's another question then about copyright. So as we know, there are often hybrid journals who publish both open access content and content that is for subscribers only. So those may have different rules for how copyright is assigned to those types of articles. So in those cases, do people often have separate copyright forms for open access versus regular articles?
I don't notice that they do in most cases. I mean, just because your content is open access does not mean that it's freely available for copying. You know, the copyright is owned by, you know, the journal or the publisher or the society. Regardless of what that entity chooses to do with the content, they own it. So I think that you probably would run into people who think, oh, but it was freely available on the internet, so I just copied this figure and I'm just using it. Well, you know, dig a little deeper, that content is actually owned by somebody, and regardless of how easy it was for you to access it, it's not okay for you to be repurposing that content just because you got access to it easily.
So we had a comment on that question, which is that a lot of open access advocates do press for a Creative Commons license on open access content. So the actual copyright for that content might be different than for regular journals. We are seeing more of that crop up. And you know, there are several different types of Creative Commons licenses, which all allow for use, but some require, you know, attribution and those types of things. So even though it's a Creative Commons license, that doesn't necessarily mean that no copyright applies. It's just certainly a more open copyright. And in the case where you would actually have content that is published under a different copyright license if it's open, and something else if it's not open, you probably do want to have, I would say, two different forms that you would want to track in that case. I mean, there's still debate. So some people say that it's not open access if it's not free use, and some people say that if it's openly available, it doesn't have to be free use. So that's going to depend on your specific requirements for copyright and what you choose to make available. So I've got another question about best practices for authorship versus contributorship. So are there best practices for defining the difference between those two things? And then also, should all contributors to research be acknowledged, for example, postdocs and other people contributing to research?
I think it probably depends on the journal. What is it that you consider to be a significant contribution to an article? Is it okay to have listed as an, you know, actual in the author list somebody who you know, helped you do the actual literature research on your paper, somebody who helped you write it? It's really, you know, what you define as a significant contribution. Obviously, somebody who conceived of an experiment and helped in the experiment itself, and, you know, collecting that data should be somebody who's on the author list. But you might want to just say, oh, well, somebody who helped me write this or did the editing of it is only put into the acknowledgement section. I think that it's a good idea to clearly define what it is that you consider to be, you know, somebody who is an actual contributing author, as opposed to somebody who's just acknowledged, you know, in the acknowledgments. Because if you will find that in some cases you'll have author lists that are, you know, 20 authors long because they're putting every person who ever passed into their lab as a contributor on the paper, and that's not necessarily the case. So it is something that I think you should define individually based on what you think is acceptable, significant contribution.
Great. So one of our listeners also pointed out that the Council of Science Editors has just released a pretty important white paper on scientific integrity and investigation workflow resources. So I thought I would go ahead and share that with the rest of you. If you want to take a look at that, I'm sure you can find the Council of Science Editors online pretty easily. And if anyone has questions about that, I'm sure I can get a link out for you guys. So it looks like that's all of the questions that we have for today. I want to thank Beverly as well as all of our attendees for today's webinar. I hope that you enjoyed the presentation and that you got some helpful information to help you either start or even modify an ethics workflow and policy for your journal. We will be sending out a brief summary that will include links to the slides and video of today's presentation, and then that will also include a link to a survey. Your input is extremely helpful, so please do take a few moments. It's a short survey, and we really do appreciate your feedback on how we can improve future webinars, as well as suggestions for future topics. So this is the final webinar in our 2014 series, and believe it or not, we'll be brainstorming soon on topics for next year. So if you want to send those topics in to me, either through the survey or if you just want to send an email to me at Allen Press, that would be acceptable as well. Don't forget, you can also continue the conversation on both Facebook and Twitter, and we really appreciate your time today. Thanks very much.